Welcome to Formation Fridays at Ascension and St. Agnes. We're starting a 3-part series on the book of Ruth, which is a beautiful story of friendship, love, and redemption found in the Old Testament. It's a short book, only 4 chapters long, and it's stuck between the books of Judges and 1 Samuel. It tells the story of Ruth, a Moabite woman, who comes to the land of the Israelites and becomes the great-grandmother of King David. I would encourage you to read it. It only takes 15 or 20 minutes because it's so short, and it's a great story. Sometimes visual images can help us understand a story better. So for this series, we're going to use the oil painting titled The Story of Ruth by Thomas Rook. It was painted in 1876 to 1877, and it's currently in the Tate Museum. And it'll be a lens to help us examine what the story has to teach us today. But first, we're going to start with an overview of the book. Over the next 2 weeks, we'll go into some more details. The story is set in the period of Judges. So when Israel was first in the land of Canaan, it actually didn't have a king. It was ruled by judges who led the army and defeated their enemies and helped the people stay faithful to God. Most of them were regional leaders. There wasn't yet really a sense of the nation of Israel. Judges 21-25 describes it as a time when everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So for a more modern comparison, think Wild Wild West in the United States. There are 2 different lands talked about in this story. The first is the land of Judah, which is a tribe of Israel, and it centers in on the city of Bethlehem. And the second is the country of Moab. Now, there was enmity between the Israelites and the Moabites. They actually are related because the Moabites are descended from the daughter of Lot, who was Abraham's nephew, and Abraham is the forefather of the Israelites. But when the Israelites were traveling from Egypt up to the land of Canaan and they spent the 40 years in the desert, the Moabites did not give aid to them as they passed through their country. And they actually even went so far as to call on the prophet Balaam to curse them. You might remember the story of Balaam's donkey from Deuteronomy. So because of this, Deuteronomy specifically says that the Moabites are not allowed into the assembly of the Lord. So, how does this impact the book of Ruth? The book of Ruth starts out with a famine in the land of Judah. And so there's a family. The husband's name is Elimelech and the wife's name is Naomi. And they take their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, to Moab, where there is food. And you can see on this map on the screen the route that they might have taken. They were pretty far from home. Then, while they're still in Moab, Elimelech dies. Mahlon and Chilion, when they grow up, marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. Then Mahlon and Chilion die too. Culturally, Ruth and Orpah would have married the brothers of their dead husbands in order to try to have sons who could keep the family name connected to their property. But Naomi doesn't have any more sons for them to marry. So Naomi suggests to them that they go back to their families of origin and find Moabite husbands. But Ruth doesn't do that. Instead of returning to her family, she travels back to Israel with Naomi. So this is a big deal considering that Ruth is a Moabitess and they're sworn enemies of Israel. But once Naomi and Ruth are back in Bethlehem, Naomi schemes to find Ruth a husband. We'll go into this more next week, but suffice it to say, they work it out so that their next of kin, Boaz, will marry Ruth. And then God blesses Ruth and Boaz with a son named Obed. And this means that they can keep the name of their family with the property. And so that's really important. But the book of Ruth ends by giving us a sneak peek into the future, because this child, Obed, becomes the father of Jesse, who is the father of King David. So that's a broad overview of what happens in the book. Now let's take a look at the art piece. To me, the most striking thing about this triptych is that it tells the story backwards. The first panel, where you would expect to see Ruth and Naomi starting out on their journey from Moab to Israel actually shows Naomi sitting with the child Obed in her lap. Why does the painter decide to start at the ending? This actually tells us something important about the story, that the child Obed is one of the main points of the story. This is because there's several reasons for this. One is that this provides hope for Naomi. She had lost all of her male relatives, all of her protection in society. She had lost the ability to keep her family property in the name of her husband Elimelech. And so this child restores to her all of those things, in addition to the joy of having a baby. The second thing is that this child is the grandfather of King David. And we now know David will be the most celebrated and the most famous of all of Israel's kings. He definitely had his failings, but in many ways he followed God faithfully and showed that he was a man after God's own heart. God even promised to David that one of his descendants would always sit on the throne of Israel. So because of her son Obed, Ruth becomes the bridge between the period of the judges and the Israelite monarchy. This story establishes David's lineage and shows that God was planning things out even before David was born. And in addition, it shows that Ruth, a Moabite woman, was David's great-grandmother, showing that God is healing the enmity between these two nations and opening up his chosen nation to foreigners. So there are a lot of reasons why this painter would start with the child who was born at the end of the book. But it doesn't stop there, because even more importantly for us, Jesus, through his earthly father Joseph and his biological mother Mary, descended from the line of David. So this little baby pictured on Naomi's lap, as well as his mother Ruth, are the ancestors of Jesus, our Messiah. Jesus is that descendant that God promised to David, who will sit on the throne of Israel forever. Jesus announced the coming of the kingdom of God during his earthly ministry. And although he ascended into heaven, he promised that he will return and bring the full reign of God to earth, with himself sitting on David's throne. And this is how God will fulfill his promise to David. And just like Ruth the Moabitess was accepted into the family of David, we Gentile Christians are grafted into the Jewish family of Abraham through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And we are welcome to share in God's promises for the people of Israel. This is how we know that God's kingdom is for us too. So, the little baby Obed sitting on Naomi's lap is important because he shows us how God is working together for the salvation of all peoples through a plan that spans generations, races, and cultures to bring all of us into God's glorious kingdom. That's it for this week. Tune in next week to hear about Ruth and Boaz's love story.